"I'll fight till my bones break," she promised. But the outcast Apache asked, "Can you love a damaged man?" The flames of Esperanza Silva's burning home lit up the New Mexico desert like a second sun, casting dancing shadows across the scrubland as smoke billowed black against the star-filled sky. She stood 50 yards away, her hands still trembling from what she had just done, watching 20 years of her life turn to ash and ember. The acrid smell of burning wood mixed with something else, the metallic scent of blood that still stained her dress, her hands, her very soul. Each crackling timber that collapsed sent sparks spiraling into the darkness, carrying with them memories of the life she would never get back. Behind her lay 3 bodies, men who had thought they could take what wasn't theirs, who had believed that a half-Spanish woman living alone on the frontier was easy prey. They had been wrong. Esperanza had learned to fight from her father, Captain Miguel Silva, a former cavalry officer who had taught her that survival meant never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting predators sense fear in your scent. But knowing how to kill and living with the aftermath were 2 different kinds of hell. And as she watched her childhood home burn, she felt the weight of what she had become settling into her bones like winter cold. The first man had come through her front door just after sunset, his face already twisted with drink and darker intentions. "Heard you're all alone out here now, little señorita," he had slurred, his hands already reaching for the buckle of his gun belt. "Figured you might want some company on these lonely nights." She had warned him once to leave, shown him her father's Navy Colt, made it clear she knew how to use it. He had laughed, called her a feisty little wildcat, and kept coming. The second man had entered through her kitchen window while she was dealing with the first, thinking to catch her from behind. The third had waited outside, holding their horses until the shooting started. Then he had made the fatal mistake of rushing in to avenge his friends. 3 shots, 3 deaths, 3 lives ended in the space of heartbeats. Esperanza had stood in her destroyed parlor afterward, surrounded by overturned furniture and spreading pools of blood, and made the hardest decision of her life. She could stay and try to explain to the territorial marshal how 3 armed men had ended up dead in her home, or she could disappear into the mountains before their friends came looking for revenge. The choice had been brutally simple, justice or survival, but not both. The sound of approaching horses cut through the night air like thunder, hoofbeats pounding against hard-packed earth in a rhythm that spoke of urgency and anger. More of them were coming. Friends of the dead men, or perhaps the territorial marshal who would see only a woman standing over corpses and not the truth of what had happened here. Either way, staying meant dying, and Esperanza Silva had survived too much to give up now. She grabbed the leather satchel that contained everything she had managed to save, her father's surgical instruments, the medical knowledge he had passed down from his army days, a collection of precious herbs her Apache grandmother had taught her to identify, the silver cross her mother had worn every day until consumption took her, and enough ammunition to make her next stand count if it came to that. She ran into the desert night, her boots slipping on loose stone as she navigated by starlight and the hard-won knowledge of 24 years spent in this unforgiving country. The burning house grew smaller behind her, but the flames seemed to follow in her peripheral vision, a constant reminder that there was no going back, no returning to the woman she had been before blood stained her hands. Her breath came in short gasps as she pushed herself harder, knowing that dawn would bring trackers, men who would follow her trail across the harsh landscape until they found her, men who would see her capture as a matter of honor and profit combined. The high desert of New Mexico territory stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape of sagebrush and Joshua trees, hidden arroyos and sudden cliff faces, a country that could kill the unprepared within days through exposure, dehydration, or simple miscalculation. Esperanza had lived here all her life, had learned from her father how to read the land for water and shelter, had absorbed from her grandmother the ancient Apache knowledge of which plants held medicine and which held death. But knowledge and endurance were different things entirely. and she was already exhausted from the fight that had claimed 3 lives and destroyed her world in the space of an hour. Miles passed beneath her feet as she climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails that twisted between towering rock formations and ancient pine trees that had stood here when her grandmother's people ruled this land without question. The air grew thinner, colder, carrying the promise of winter snows that would make these peaks impassable for months. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant capture, and capture meant a noose around her neck, regardless of the justice of her actions. No territorial court would believe her version of events. 3 men dead by a woman's hand was murder in the eyes of the law, self-defense being a luxury rarely afforded to those without wealth or political connections. Her father had prepared her for this possibility, though neither of them had imagined it would come to pass so soon after his death from an Apache arrow during a supply run to Santa Fe. "Misha," he had told her during their last hunting trip together, "this country doesn't forgive weakness, but it also doesn't forgive those who are too strong. A woman who can fight like a man makes men uncomfortable, and uncomfortable men do stupid things." He had taught her to shoot, to track, to move silently through terrain that would challenge experienced soldiers. But he had also taught her something more valuable: how to think tactically, how to assess threats and opportunities with the cold calculation of a military mind. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded her painfully of better mornings, Esperanza stumbled and fell, her strength finally giving out after hours of climbing. She had gained nearly 2,000 feet in elevation, following paths that most white settlers had never seen, routes her grandmother had shown her during childhood visits to gather medicinal plants. Her dress was torn from thorns and rocks, her hands bloodied from climbing, but she had put significant distance between herself and her pursuers. More importantly, she had entered country where her mixed heritage became an advantage rather than a liability. It was then she saw the smoke, not the black, angry smoke of a burning building, but the thin, grey wisp of a carefully tended fire. The kind maintained by someone who understood that smoke signals could bring unwanted visitors. Someone was camped nearby, hidden among the rocks and trees that dotted this remote mountainside. Someone skilled enough to minimize their presence while still maintaining the necessities of survival. Esperanza's hand went instinctively to the pistol at her hip, her father's Navy Colt, its walnut grip worn smooth from years of use. Its weight a familiar comfort in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. After what had happened at her home, she would never again be caught defenseless or unprepared. She crept closer, moving with the stealth her father had taught her during hunting trips in these same mountains, using shadows and natural cover to mask her approach. Her grandmother's blood served her well here, providing instincts for moving silently through country that would betray a careless footstep with echoing stone or snapping branches. The camp was modest, a small fire ring built with stones that would contain heat efficiently, a lean-to shelter constructed against a rock outcropping that would provide protection from wind and weather. Supplies arranged with military precision that spoke of long experience with frontier living. But it was the man sitting beside the fire who stopped her cold. He was Apache. That much was clear from his dress and the way he held himself, the careful attention to his surroundings that marked him as a warrior even in repose. But something was terribly wrong with this picture. Extensive scars covered the left side of his face and neck, the kind that spoke of deliberate torture or terrible accident, and his left arm hung useless at his side, the hand curled in a way that suggested permanent damage. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with pieces of military gear, a blue cavalry jacket that had seen better days, moccasins decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of careful craftsmanship, a knife at his belt that looked both well-maintained and frequently used. Most telling of all, he was completely alone. No Apache warrior traveled alone unless he was cast out, banished from his people for some unforgivable crime or catastrophic failure of duty. This man was an outcast, living in exile in these mountains, as much a fugitive from justice as she was, though likely for very different reasons. Esperanza watched him for long minutes, noting how he favored his right side, how his eyes constantly scanned the surrounding terrain even as he tended his fire with practiced efficiency. This was a man who had learned to live with constant vigilance, who expected attack from any direction and had arranged his life accordingly. A branch snapped under her foot, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the mountain stillness. The Apache warrior was on his feet instantly, moving with surprising speed despite his injuries, a rifle in his good hand with the muzzle pointed directly at her hiding place. The weapon was an army Springfield, probably taken from a dead soldier, and he held it with the familiarity of someone who had used it many times before. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, the words carefully chosen by someone who had learned the language from necessity rather than education. "Come out slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." Esperanza stepped from behind the boulder that had concealed her, her hand still resting on her pistol grip but making no threatening moves. She understood that she was at a severe disadvantage here. Tired, alone, in unfamiliar territory despite her mountain knowledge. Up close, she could see that his scars were old but extensive, covering not just his face but disappearing beneath his clothing in patterns that suggested systematic torture rather than battle wounds. Whatever had happened to this man had been deliberate, personal and thorough. "You are not a tracker," he observed, his dark eyes taking in her torn dress, her bloodied hands, the exhaustion that made her sway slightly on her feet. "Your movement is too loud, your approach too direct. You are running from something, not hunting it." "So are you," Esperanza replied, her voice hoarse from the smoke and the long night of climbing. "Apache don't live alone unless their people have cast them out. Warriors travel in groups, hunt together, fight together. A man alone is either dead or wishes he was." For a moment, something that might have been surprise flickered across his scarred features. Most white settlers wouldn't know enough about Apache customs to make such an observation, wouldn't understand the social structures that governed tribal life. Her knowledge marked her as someone who had spent time among his people, or at least had been taught by someone who understood Apache culture. He lowered his rifle slightly but kept it ready, his posture remaining alert. "My name is Atohi," he said simply, offering the information as both introduction and test. If she understood Apache naming customs, she would know that sharing his name carried significance, implied a level of trust that was not given lightly. "Esperanza Silva, and I need help." "What kind of help?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of threat and opportunity that marked an experienced warrior. He was weighing the risks of involvement against whatever code of honor still governed his actions, trying to determine if helping her would bring more danger into his carefully controlled exile. "3 men tried to take my land, tried to take me," she said, the words coming out in a rush of honesty that surprised her with its intensity. "I killed them, all 3. Shot them dead in my own parlor when they wouldn't take no for an answer. Now their friends are coming for revenge, and the law will see me hanged for defending myself because I'm a woman and I'm half Mexican, and that makes me guilty of something no matter what actually happened." Atohi studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the blood on her dress, the way she held herself despite her exhaustion, like a fighter who hadn't yet surrendered. Like someone who had learned that showing weakness invited attack. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of warriors he had known, people who understood that survival sometimes required terrible choices. When he spoke again, his voice held a different quality, something that might have been respect mixed with recognition. "You killed 3 men. They gave me no choice. They came into my home with rape and theft on their minds, figured a woman alone would be easy prey. I warned them once, showed them my gun, told them to leave. They laughed." Her voice grew harder, colder. They stopped laughing when I put bullets in their hearts, and now you run to the mountains, thinking the high country will hide you from white man's justice. That elevation and isolation will keep you safe from the consequences of your actions." It wasn't a question, and Esperanza didn't treat it like one. She could hear the skepticism in his voice, the doubt of someone who had seen too many people make poor decisions based on desperation rather than planning. "I know these mountains better than most. My grandmother was Apache, taught me the old ways of moving through this country. I can survive here for how long? A week, a month. Winter comes early at this elevation, and you are not prepared for it. Your dress is already torn, your hands bleeding from just one night of climbing. The men who hunt you will not give up easily. They will see your escape as a challenge to their authority, an insult that must be answered." His scarred face was impassive, but his eyes held knowledge born of hard experience with pursuit and capture. "They will bring dogs, professional trackers, enough supplies to wait you out. And when they find you, they will make sure your death serves as an example to other women who might think to defend themselves." Esperanza felt her heart sink as the truth of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had been running on desperation and stubbornness, fueled by the immediate need to escape rather than any real plan for long-term survival. This Apache warrior was right. She was buying time, not freedom. And time had a way of running out when powerful men wanted you dead. "Then I'll fight them when they come," she said, lifting her chin defiantly in a gesture her father would have recognized. "I'll fight till my bones break before I let them take me back to hang for defending my honor and my home." Atohi was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't respond, that he was simply waiting for her to realize the futility of her situation and leave his camp. When he finally spoke, his words cut through her defiance like a blade through silk, sharp and precise and utterly without mercy. "Fighting until you break is not the same as fighting to win, woman. A broken warrior cannot continue the fight, cannot protect what matters, cannot serve any purpose except as a warning to others. Your enemies want you to fight until you break. It makes their victory easier and their story more convincing. Then what would you have me do? Surrender? Walk back down this mountain and let them put a rope around my neck for having the audacity to defend myself. Let them turn my death into proof that women should submit quietly to whatever men decide to do to them. I would have you think like a warrior instead of like a victim," he said, his voice growing harsh now, challenging in a way that made her spine straighten instinctively. "A warrior knows when to fight and when to retreat, when to stand ground and when to disappear. A warrior understands that survival requires more than courage. It requires wisdom, planning, patience, and the ability to see beyond the immediate battle to the war that follows." Esperanza stared at this scarred stranger, this outcast Apache who spoke of warfare and wisdom while living alone in the mountains like a hermit or a ghost. There was something in his manner, in the way he carried himself despite his injuries, that spoke of extensive experience with both victory and defeat. His words carried the weight of hard-won knowledge, the kind that came from surviving when survival seemed impossible. "You're offering to help me. I am offering to teach you to survive. But survival in these mountains in this life requires more than fighting spirit and righteous anger." His damaged face grew serious, his dark eyes holding depths of pain and loss that she could only guess at. "Can you learn to live with the choices you have made? Can you accept that the woman who killed 3 men in defense of her home is not the same woman who woke up that morning? Can you build a new life from the ashes of the old one, even if it means becoming someone you never expected to be?" The questions hung in the air between them like morning mist, heavy with implications that went far beyond simple survival. Esperanza looked at this Apache warrior, at his scars and his exile, at the careful way he held himself as if expecting attack from any direction. She recognized something familiar in his bearing, the stance of someone who had lost everything and was still learning how to keep going. who had been forced to rebuild his identity from fragments of his former self. "Why would you help me?" she asked, needing to understand his motivations before she could trust his offer. "You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Helping a fugitive would only bring more trouble into your life, because I understand what it means to be cast out by your own kind, to be judged for actions that seemed necessary at the time, but look like crimes in hindsight. Because I know the weight of living with choices that cannot be undone, decisions that change you in ways you never anticipated." His voice grew softer, more personal, carrying pain that had been carefully contained but never fully healed. "And because a woman who can kill 3 men to defend herself, who can climb these mountains in the dark while bleeding and exhausted, deserves the chance to live with the consequences of her courage rather than die for having it." Esperanza felt tears threaten for the first time since the attack on her home, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of unexpected kindness. This stranger, this outcast, was offering her something no one else would: understanding without judgment, help without conditions that would compromise her dignity or independence. But she could see in his eyes that there was more to his offer than simple sympathy for a fellow exile. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, her instincts warning her that his proposal came with complications he hadn't yet revealed. Atohi was quiet for a moment, his good hand absently touching the scarred side of his face in a gesture that spoke of long habit and constant pain. When he looked at her again, there was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her understand why he lived alone in these mountains rather than seeking others who might accept his exile. Learning to survive is not the same as learning to live. "Esperanza Silva, I can teach you to hide from your enemies, to hunt and gather in this country, to move through these mountains without leaving tracks that can be followed. I can show you how to read weather patterns, how to find water in the desert, how to make weapons from stone and wood when ammunition runs out." His voice grew quieter, more uncertain. "But I have forgotten how to trust another person's word, how to hope that tomorrow might be better than today, how to believe that damaged people can still find reasons to care about something beyond mere survival." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face as if trying to read her reaction before committing to words that couldn't be taken back. "Can you love a damaged man, Esperanza Silva? Can you see past scars that run deeper than flesh to whatever might still be worth saving underneath? Because that is what I am asking of you, not just to let me help you survive, but to help me remember what it means to be human, rather than just a collection of wounds and regrets." The question hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending her mind reeling with implications she hadn't expected. This wasn't just about survival or sanctuary. This Apache warrior was asking her to consider a future neither of them had expected to have, to risk her heart on a man who had been broken by whatever had driven him into exile. He was offering to save her life, but only if she was willing to gamble her emotional survival on someone whose damage might run too deep for healing. Esperanza looked around at the harsh beauty of the mountain landscape, at the smoke from Atohi's small fire rising into the brightening sky, at the careful way he had arranged his simple camp to blend with the natural surroundings. This was a man who had learned to make a life out of nothing, to find dignity in exile, to maintain his humanity despite whatever terrible experiences had carved those scars into his flesh and soul. The weight of his question, whether she could love a damaged man, hung between them like a challenge and a confession combined. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper in the mountain stillness. "I don't know if I can love anyone right now. I've got blood on my hands and fire in my past, and 3 dead men whose faces will haunt my dreams for whatever years I have left. I don't know what kind of future that leaves me, what kind of woman I've become." Atohi nodded slowly, as if he had expected no other answer, as if honesty in the face of impossible questions was more valuable than false promises or easy comfort. "Then we will learn together. You how to live as an outcast in a world that wants you dead. And I how to live with someone who might choose to stay when staying becomes a choice rather than necessity. He shouldered his rifle with his good arm and began, breaking camp with efficient movements that spoke of long practice at quick departures. Despite the handicap of his damaged left arm, he moved with purpose and grace, each action calculated to waste neither time nor energy. There is a place deeper in the mountains, a valley where the streams run clean and game is plentiful, where winter comes late and spring comes early. We can be there by nightfall if we leave now. And if I can't learn what you're trying to teach me? Esperanza asked, watching him secure his meager possessions with the precision of a military man. If I'm too set in my ways, too damaged by what happened, too afraid to trust. Tohi paused in his packing, looking at her with those dark eyes that held so much pain and so much stubborn hope. Then at least you will have tried to live instead of simply trying to die fighting. That is more than most people manage when the world turns against them. As they prepared to climb higher into the Sangre de Cristo mountains, Esperanza felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. This Apache warrior, this outcast named Tohi, was offering her more than sanctuary or survival skills. He was offering her a chance to discover who she might become when the burning was over and the real work of living began. The trail Tohi chose wound through country that seemed untouched by human presence, following ridgelines that offered spectacular views of the desert below while remaining hidden from casual observation. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every rock and tree, every source of water and shelter, every danger that might threaten their passage. Esperanza followed, struggling to match his pace despite her exhaustion, learning through necessity to place her feet where his had been, to breathe with the thin mountain air, to read the land the way he did. "Your grandmother was Apache," he said, after they had walked in silence for over an hour. It wasn't a question. Something in her movement, her instinctive responses to the terrain, had confirmed what her earlier words had suggested. "From which band?" "Mescalero," Esperanza replied, grateful for conversation that might distract her from the burning in her lungs and legs. "My mother's mother. She married a Mexican vaquero, lived on a ranch near Las Cruces until the cavalry came through in 1862. After that, she stayed with my grandfather's family, raised my mother as Mexican rather than Apache. Wise woman. The soldiers would have killed her children if they had known their bloodline." Tohi's voice held bitter knowledge of such tragedies. "But she taught you the old ways?" "Some of them. How to find water in the desert, which plants could heal and which could kill. How to move silently through different kinds of terrain. She said knowledge was like seeds. Plant them in a child's mind, and they would grow when needed, even if years passed before the need arose. Your grandmother understood survival. Most Apache children of mixed blood learned to hide their heritage, to become invisible among the Mexicans and whites who wanted to pretend we no longer existed." He pointed to a barely visible game trail that branched off from their current path. "We go this way now. Steeper, but it will put us beyond the reach of tracking dogs." The new trail lived up to his warning about steepness. Within minutes, Esperanza was using her hands as much as her feet, scrambling over loose rock and exposed roots while trying not to look at the dizzying drops that opened beside them. Tohi climbed with surprising grace despite his injuries, his good arm doing the work of two as he pulled himself up sections that would have challenged an uninjured man. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked during a brief rest on a narrow ledge, her breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with the altitude. 3 years, he replied, his eyes scanning the valley below for signs of pursuit. "Since my people decided that a warrior who could no longer fight was no longer worth feeding." The bitterness in his voice made her look at him more carefully, noting details she had missed in their earlier encounter. The scars on his face and neck continued down beneath his shirt, and his left hand was curled in a way that suggested nerve damage rather than simple injury. This was not battle damage, but something far more deliberate and personal. What happened to you? She asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw him stiffen. I'm sorry, that's not my business. You have a right to know what kind of man you are traveling with, Atohi said quietly. Whether his enemies might become yours, whether his past might endanger your future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I was captured by Mexican soldiers 3 years ago during a raid to recover stolen Apache children. They decided to make an example of me, to show what happened to warriors who dared to fight for their families. Esperanza felt ice form in her stomach as she began to understand the source of his scars, the reason for his exile. They tortured you for 3 days. Fire, knives, other things I will not speak of in the presence of a woman. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing weather rather than unspeakable trauma. On the 4th day, a young lieutenant who still had some honor left helped me escape. But by then, the damage was done. Your arm cannot draw a bow or wield a war club, cannot provide for a family or protect a band of warriors in battle. Among my people, a warrior who cannot fight is a burden, a mouth to feed that produces nothing of value. The pain in his voice went deeper than physical injury. My own brother cast the final vote to banish me, said it was kinder than letting me live as a cripple among whole men. Esperanza stared at him, seeing his story with new eyes. This man had not simply been injured. He had been systematically destroyed, then abandoned by the very people he had risked everything to protect. The fact that he had survived at all, let alone built some kind of life in these mountains, spoke to a strength that went far beyond physical capability. Your people were wrong, she said fiercely. A man's worth isn't measured by what he can do with weapons. What is it measured by then? The question was genuine, not rhetorical. What makes a man valuable if not his ability to provide and protect? His willingness to keep trying when everything falls apart. His ability to offer hope to someone who has none. His courage to trust again after the world has proven it can't be trusted. She met his eyes steadily. His decision to help a stranger when helping means risking what little safety he has left. Atohi studied her face, as if trying to determine whether her words were sincere or merely polite comfort. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because some of the tension left his shoulders. You speak like someone who has thought deeply about such things. I've had reason to. My father was wounded in the war, lost the use of his right leg in a cavalry charge that saved his regiment. When he came home, people treated him like he was broken, like his sacrifice had somehow made him less of a man. It made me angry then, and it makes me angry now. Yet he raised a daughter who can kill 3 men and escape into the mountains without losing her courage. That is not the achievement of a broken man. No, Esperanza agreed, feeling warmth spread through her chest at the recognition in his voice. It's not. They resumed climbing, but the atmosphere between them had shifted subtly. The careful politeness of strangers was giving way to something more complex, recognition of shared experience. Perhaps, or simply the beginning of trust between 2 people who had learned not to trust easily. The sun was approaching its zenith when they finally reached Atohi's hidden valley, and Esperanza had to admit it was worth the brutal climb. Nestled between towering peaks that would shield it from the worst weather, the valley contained everything needed for survival. Fresh water from multiple springs, grass for grazing animals, timber for construction, and natural shelter in the form of caves and rock overhangs. Most importantly, it was accessible only through the treacherous path they had just climbed, making it nearly impossible for enemies to approach undetected. "This is where you've been living?" she asked, taking in the careful modifications Atohi had made to the natural landscape. A lean-to shelter built against a cliff face, a fire ring positioned to minimize smoke visibility, caches of food and supplies hidden in locations that would be invisible to casual observation. It was a fortress, disguised as wilderness, a place where a careful man could live indefinitely without being discovered. For 3 years, he confirmed, setting down his pack near the fire ring. Long enough to learn which caves stay dry in winter, where to find medicine plants, how to hunt without depleting the game. Long enough to understand that survival and living are different things. What do you mean? Tohi looked around at his carefully ordered domain, and for the first time since she had met him, Esperanza saw something like sadness in his expression. I have learned to keep my body alive, to maintain health and strength, to be ready for whatever dangers might come. But I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to, someone to share the burden of staying alert, someone whose safety mattered more than my own. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest in a way that made Esperanza's throat tighten. She understood what he was telling her, that his offer to help her was as much about his own desperate loneliness as it was about her need for survival skills. "Show me what I need to learn," she said simply. Over the following hours, Tohi began her education in mountain survival with the thoroughness of a man who understood that half knowledge could be worse than ignorance. He showed her how to purify water using sand and charcoal, how to identify which berries were safe to eat and which would cause sickness or death, how to set snares that would catch rabbits and squirrels without alerting predators to their presence. His teaching style was patient but demanding. He would demonstrate a technique once, then expect her to repeat it until she could perform it reliably, even while tired or distracted. "Your hands are soft," he observed as she struggled to create friction fire with a bow drill setup. "How long since you did physical work?" "My father left me enough money to hire help for the heavy labor around our place," she admitted, feeling inadequate as the tinder failed to catch for the 4th time. "I kept house, tended a garden, helped with medical emergencies when people couldn't afford a real doctor. But I never had to build fires from scratch or hunt my own food. Soft hands can learn," Tohi said, his good hand covering hers to adjust her grip on the bow. "But soft thinking will kill you. Out here, every mistake has consequences. A poorly built fire might give away your position to enemies. A poorly set snare might mean going hungry when you cannot afford to be weak. Soft thinking makes you believe that someone will rescue you, that your situation is temporary, that you can return to your old life if you just wait long enough." His words stung because they carried truth she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Part of her was still thinking like a woman who expected this ordeal to end, who believed she could somehow return to being the person she had been before 3 men died in her parlor. "How do I learn to think differently?" "By accepting that Esperanza Silva, the landowner, is dead," he said bluntly. "By understanding that the woman who climbs mountains and learns to survive in the wilderness is someone new, someone who must be built from whatever pieces of the old woman were worth keeping." The harshness of his words made her flinch, but she forced herself to consider them seriously. Was he right? Had the woman who had lived peacefully on her inherited land truly died when she put bullets in those 3 men? Was trying to preserve her old identity just another form of soft thinking that would get her killed? "It's frightening," she admitted, "not knowing who I'm supposed to become. All birth is frightening," Tohi replied. "But the alternative to being born again is remaining dead. And you are not dead yet, Esperanza Silva. There is too much fire in you for death to claim easily." As the afternoon wore on, her lessons expanded beyond basic survival skills to include elements of Apache warfare and stealth. Tohi taught her how to move through different types of terrain without leaving tracks, how to use natural cover to remain invisible even in open ground, how to read the behavior of birds and animals to detect the presence of human intruders. His methods were demanding and sometimes painful. He would deliberately startle her during delicate tasks to test her reactions under stress, would criticize her mistakes with brutal honesty. would push her to continue practicing even when exhaustion made her hands shake. "Why are you being so hard on me?" she finally asked after he had made her repeat a stalking exercise for the 6th time, pointing out flaws in her technique that seemed impossibly subtle. "Because your enemies will not be gentle with you," he replied without sympathy. "Because the mountains do not care about your feelings when you make mistakes that could cost your life. Because learning to survive requires breaking down the soft parts of yourself that expect comfort and rebuilding them into something harder. And what if I don't want to become hard? What if I want to keep some part of who I used to be?" Tohi stopped his instruction and looked at her with something that might have been compassion mixed with ruthless pragmatism. "Then you will die, and your softness will die with you, and nothing of value will remain. Better to choose what parts of yourself to preserve and what parts to sacrifice than to let circumstances make those choices for you," his words forced her to confront a question she had been avoiding since fleeing her burning home. What aspects of her old self were worth fighting to preserve, and what parts had been luxuries she could no longer afford? Her education, her medical knowledge, her determination to help others, those seemed valuable. Her expectation of safety, her belief that justice would protect the innocent, her assumption that other people would respect her boundaries, those had already proven to be dangerous illusions. Evening found them sitting beside a carefully banked fire, sharing a meal of roasted rabbit that Tohi had taken with a snare while she practiced other skills. The meat was tough and gamey compared to the beef she was accustomed to, but it tasted like survival, like independence, like the beginning of a life that depended on no one's generosity or protection except what she could earn through her own efforts. "Tell me about the men who are hunting you," Tohi said as they ate. "What kind of enemies they are, what resources they have, how far they might be willing to go for revenge." Esperanza considered how to explain the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed life in territorial New Mexico. "The 3 men I killed were brothers. The Morrison brothers, Tom, Jake, and Billy. Their family owns most of the businesses in our nearest town, controls the territorial judge, has connections with both legitimate ranchers and outlaw bands who work the borderland between New Mexico and Mexico. Powerful enemies then, the worst kind. Rich enough to buy whatever help they need, connected enough to make sure the law works in their favor, ruthless enough to make examples of people who cross them." She poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral into the darkening sky, but also arrogant enough to underestimate a half-Mexican woman who learned to shoot from a cavalry officer. "Arrogance can be used against them," Tohi observed. "Powerful men often assume their power makes them invulnerable. They take risks that more careful enemies would avoid. What kind of risks? They will come after you themselves instead of hiring professionals who might be more skilled at tracking and survival. They will bring too many men, make too much noise, expect to overwhelm you with numbers rather than outsmart you with strategy." His scarred face was thoughtful in the firelight. "And they will not expect you to have help from someone who knows how to fight their kind of war. You're talking about ambushing them. I am talking about survival, about using every advantage available to ensure that your enemies do not succeed in killing you." He met her eyes across the fire. "Are you prepared to kill again if necessary?" The question hit her like cold water, forcing her to confront the reality of what her new life might require. Could she shoot down more men even in self-defense? Could she become the kind of person who planned ambushes and calculated the best ways to kill her enemies? "I don't know," she said honestly. "Killing those 3 men was horrible, even though they gave me no choice. The thought of deliberately planning to kill more people makes me sick." "That is good," Tohi said, surprising her. "A person who enjoys killing is dangerous to everyone around them, including their allies. But a person who cannot kill when killing is necessary is dangerous to themselves and those who depend on them for protection. So what do I do with that?" You learn to think of killing as a tool, like fire or a knife, dangerous if used carelessly, but necessary for survival in certain circumstances. You practice until your body can act without your mind having time to hesitate. And you accept that the person you become through this training will be different from the person you were before it became necessary. As the fire burned lower and the mountain night grew cold around them, Esperanza found herself studying this damaged Apache warrior who was offering to teach her not just survival skills, but the mindset of someone who lived constantly on the edge of violence. There was something both frightening and compelling about his absolute pragmatism, his willingness to face harsh truths without flinching or seeking comfort in pleasant illusions. "Why did you really offer to help me?" she asked. "And don't tell me it's just because you understand what it means to be cast out. There's something else, something you're not saying." Atohi was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because for 3 years I have lived like a ghost, existing but not truly alive. Because seeing you fight for your life reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for, still reasons to hope that tomorrow might be different from today." He looked at her across the dying fire, his scarred face vulnerable in ways she was just beginning to understand. "And because I thought that maybe, if I could help someone else learn to live again, I might remember how to do it myself." The admission hung between them, like a bridge across an impossible canyon, fragile and precious and terrifying in its honesty. Esperanza realized that they were both refugees from their former lives, both trying to figure out who they might become when everything they had once been was no longer possible. The difference was that he had been alone in that struggle for 3 years, while she was just beginning to understand its magnitude. 2 weeks into her mountain education, Esperanza's hands had developed calluses thick enough to handle rough work without bleeding, and her legs had grown strong enough to climb the steep trails without leaving her gasping for breath every 100 yards. But the real changes went deeper than physical conditioning. She was learning to think differently, to see the world through the eyes of someone who lived constantly on the edge of survival, rather than someone who expected the world to provide safety and comfort. The transformation wasn't gentle. Each morning, Atohi would wake her before dawn with tasks that pushed her beyond what she thought possible, scaling cliff faces that seemed impossible to climb, moving silently through terrain filled with loose rocks and dry branches that wanted to announce her presence to anyone within miles, tracking wounded animals through country where a single misplaced step could send her tumbling into ravines that would claim her bones for decades. His teaching methods were relentlessly demanding, mixing Apache warfare techniques with hard-earned lessons from 3 years of solitary survival. "You move like someone who expects the ground to hold you," he observed, on a morning when she had stumbled for the 3rd time while practicing stealth approaches. "Like someone who has never considered that the earth itself might betray your presence to enemies. Watch." He demonstrated the technique again, his damaged body somehow finding ways to distribute his weight that made no sound even on the most treacherous surfaces. Despite his injuries, he could move through the forest like smoke, leaving no sign of his passage except to eyes trained to see the subtle disturbances that marked any human presence. When he wanted to be invisible, he achieved a kind of ghostly perfection that made her understand how Apache warriors had terrorized the frontier for decades. "I can't do that," Esperanza protested, after her 4th failed attempt to cross a section of loose shale without creating a cascade of noise. "You've been doing this your whole life." "I've had 2 weeks. Apache children learn these skills from the time they can walk," Atohi agreed. "But they also learn them through games and play, over years of practice with no immediate consequences for failure. You must learn them as an adult, under pressure, with your life depending on perfection you have not had time to develop naturally. That's impossible. No, that is why most people who attempt to live as we are living die within the first month." His voice was matter-of-fact, carrying no sympathy for her frustration. "They expect learning to be comfortable, gradual, forgiving of mistakes. But the mountains do not grade on a curve, Esperanza. Excellence is the minimum standard for survival." The harshness of his words stung, but she was beginning to understand the deadly serious purpose behind his demanding approach. Every skill he taught her was something she might need to use perfectly on the first attempt, with no opportunity for practice or correction. The ability to move silently might mean the difference between avoiding her enemies and walking into an ambush. The knowledge of which plants were safe to eat could prevent poisoning that would kill her slowly and agonizingly. The techniques for reading weather patterns might save her from freezing to death in a sudden mountain storm. Her education expanded beyond basic survival into areas that chilled her blood even as she recognized their necessity. Atohi taught her how to set deadfalls that would kill pursuing horses, how to prepare poison arrows from plants that grew in their hidden valley, how to construct traps that would maim or kill human beings who followed their trail too closely. These were not the skills of someone trying to avoid violence, but of someone preparing for war. "I thought you were going to teach me to hide," she said one afternoon, after he had shown her how to prepare stakes hardened in fire and concealed in pits that would cripple anyone who stepped in them. "This feels more like learning to fight." "Hiding is fighting," Atohi replied, adjusting the position of the stakes to maximize their effectiveness. "Running is fighting. Disappearing into country your enemies cannot survive is fighting. The goal is not to avoid conflict. The goal is to choose the time, place, and terms of conflict so that your victory is assured. Before the first shot is fired, you sound like a general planning a military campaign. I am a warrior teaching another warrior how to think strategically instead of reactively." He looked at her with those dark eyes that held so much, accumulated pain and knowledge. "Your enemies have numbers, weapons, supplies, connections with law enforcement. You have knowledge of this terrain, the advantage of being hunted rather than hunting, and the desperation of someone fighting for her life. We must make your advantages count for more than theirs." The strategic thinking he was teaching her required a fundamental shift in how she understood her situation. Instead of seeing herself as a victim fleeing from superior forces, she was learning to think like a predator, choosing when and how to strike back against enemies who had made the mistake of underestimating her. It was a terrifying transformation, but also oddly liberating. She was no longer simply running from the consequences of defending herself, but actively preparing to destroy anyone who threatened her new life. Her relationship with Atohi was evolving as well, though neither of them spoke directly about the growing complexity of their connection. He remained demanding and sometimes harsh in his instruction, but she began to notice moments of unexpected gentleness. The way he would wordlessly hand her his water gourd when she was struggling with thirst during difficult lessons. How he would position himself between her and potential dangers even when there was no immediate threat. The careful way he tended cuts and bruises she acquired during training without making her feel weak for having acquired them. One evening, as they sat beside their carefully concealed fire, sharing a meal of trout he had taken from the valley's main stream, she finally asked the question that had been building in her mind for days. "What happened to your wife?" The question hung in the air like smoke from their fire, heavy with implications and potential pain. Atohi was quiet for so long that she began to regret asking, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of grief that had been carefully contained but never fully processed. "She was killed during the raid where I was captured," he said simply. "Shot down while trying to protect our daughter, who was 7 years old and beautiful, and laughed like running water over stones." Esperanza felt her throat tighten with sympathetic pain. "Your daughter too? Taken alive by the soldiers, along with 6 other Apache children. The raid was supposed to recover them from a Mexican ranch where they were being held as slaves, but the soldiers were waiting for us. Someone had betrayed our plans, told them exactly when and where we would attack." His scarred hands clenched into fists as he spoke. "We saved no one. We lost everything, and that's when they captured you. I stayed behind to buy time for the other warriors to escape, to give them a chance to carry word back to our people about what had happened. I killed 5 soldiers before they brought me down, but it was not enough. It is never enough when those you love die while you live." The raw pain in his voice made her want to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort. But she sensed that such gestures would not be welcome. This was a wound that had been festering for 3 years, poisoning his ability to hope or trust or believe that the future could be different from the past. Understanding began to dawn about why he had offered to help her, not just because he was lonely, but because her fight reminded him of his own. Because teaching her to survive gave him a way to honor the family he had failed to save. "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Your daughter, Ayana. It means eternal blossom in our language. And she was like that, always growing, always reaching for sunlight, always finding beauty in places where others saw only hardship." For the first time since she had known him, Atohi's voice broke slightly. She would be 10 years old now if she still lives. Old enough to remember who she was before the soldiers took her, but young enough that she might forget if they work hard enough to make her forget. Esperanza understood now why he lived alone in these mountains, why he had been so ready to help a stranger whose situation echoed his own losses. He was not just teaching her survival skills, he was fighting a war that had already been lost, trying to save someone when he had been unable to save the people who mattered most to him. The knowledge made her heart ache for him, but also made her understand the intensity of his training methods. He was determined that she would not suffer the same fate as his wife and daughter. "I'm not going to die," she said firmly, meeting his eyes across the fire. "Not from those Morrison bastards, not from the mountains, not from my own ignorance or weakness. You're too good a teacher for me to fail, and I'm too stubborn to quit learning." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle relaxation of muscles she hadn't realized were tense. "You sound more like a warrior now, and less like a frightened woman. Maybe that's because I am more like a warrior now. Maybe that's what you've been trying to teach me all along, not just how to survive, but how to fight back. Fighting back requires more than skill with weapons or knowledge of tactics," Atohi said. "It requires the willingness to become someone harder than your enemies, more ruthless than those who would destroy you. Are you prepared for that transformation?" The question forced her to confront aspects of herself she had never examined closely. Was she capable of the kind of calculated violence that would be required to defeat the Morrison family? Could she plan ambushes, set lethal traps, kill men from hiding rather than in face-to-face combat? The woman she had been 3 weeks ago would have been horrified by such possibilities. But that woman was dead, killed by the same bullets that had ended 3 lives in her parlor. "I'm learning to be," she said honestly. "It frightens me, but not as much as the thought of being helpless again. Good. Fear of what you might become is healthy. It will keep you from becoming a monster. But fear of being powerless will kill you faster than any enemy." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "Tomorrow we begin the final phase of your education. You will learn to hunt men instead of animals, to think like a killer instead of a survivor." The word sent a chill down her spine, but also a strange thrill of anticipation. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting other people's actions determine the shape of her life. If the Morrison brothers wanted a war, she was finally ready to give them one. That night, she dreamed of fire and blood, of men screaming in traps she had set with her own hands, of herself standing over the bodies of her enemies with smoke rising from the barrel of her father's pistol. When she woke, the dreams didn't horrify her as much as she thought they should. Instead, they felt like visions of a future she was finally strong enough to create for herself. The next morning brought the sound that both of them had been dreading and expecting, distant hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls below their hidden valley. Their enemies had finally found the trail leading to their sanctuary, and the time for learning was over. Now they would discover whether her education had been sufficient to keep them both alive. Atohi was on his feet instantly, moving to a vantage point that would let him observe the approaches to their valley without exposing himself to hostile fire. "How many?" Esperanza asked, checking her weapons with hands that were steadier than she had expected. "At least 6 riders, possibly more." His voice was calm, professional, the voice of a warrior who had faced such situations many times before. "They are moving carefully, following our trail, but watching for ambushes. They have learned caution, which makes them more dangerous. Are they Morrison men?" "Some of them. But there are others, men who move like professionals, like soldiers or experienced bounty hunters." He turned from his observation point to look at her with those dark eyes that had seen too much violence. "These are not the kind of men who will give up easily or be discouraged by the loss of a few companions." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Esperanza felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of ruthless calculation she had seen in Atohi's face when he discussed tactics for killing their enemies. "Then we don't discourage them. We destroy them, all of them. Every last one. We make sure that no one goes back to tell the Morrison family where to find us. No one survives to bring more hunters. No one lives to threaten the life we're trying to build here." Her voice was steady, certain, carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "This ends today, one way or another." Atohi studied her face, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You understand what you are saying? What kind of action you are committing yourself to?" "I understand that I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting other people decide whether I live or die." She checked the loads in her pistol with movements that were becoming automatic. "I understand that the woman who lived peacefully on inherited land is never coming back. And the woman who's replacing her is someone who doesn't leave enemies alive to try again. Then we fight," Atohi said simply. "We use every advantage this terrain gives us, every trap we have prepared, every skill you have learned. And when it is over, we will know if your transformation is complete." They spent the next hour setting final preparations, positioning weapons caches, checking the deadfalls and pit traps they had constructed over the past 2 weeks, reviewing the signals they would use to coordinate their movements during the coming battle. Esperanza found herself moving with a confidence she wouldn't have believed possible just days earlier. Her body responding to training that had become instinctive, her mind calculating angles and timing with the cold precision Atohi had tried to teach her. "Remember," he said, as they took their positions among the rocks that guarded the valley's main approach, "you are not the same woman who killed 3 men in her parlor. You are an Apache warrior who has learned to think strategically, to fight with patience and intelligence rather than desperate courage alone." "And what are you?" she asked, settling into a firing position that would give her clear shots at multiple approach routes while keeping her concealed from return fire. "I'm a man who has found something worth protecting again," Atohi replied, his scarred face showing an expression she had never seen before, not quite love, but something deeper and more fierce. "I am a warrior who will not fail this time." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the voices of men who believed they were close to claiming their prize. Esperanza sighted down the barrel of her rifle, waiting for the first target to present itself, and realized that she was no longer afraid. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine not just whether she lived or died, but what kind of person she had chosen to become. The frightened woman who had fled her burning home was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous than her enemies had expected to find. "They're in range," Atohi whispered from his position 30 yards to her left. "I see them," she replied, her finger finding the trigger with steady precision. The war for her new life was about to begin. The first shot shattered the mountain stillness like breaking glass. Esperanza's rifle speaking with deadly authority as the lead rider pitched sideways from his saddle, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. His horse reared and bolted, carrying panic through the tight formation of men who had expected to find a frightened woman cowering in some cave. Not a trained warrior with the high ground and carefully prepared positions. "Ambush!" someone screamed, and the canyon erupted into chaos. Horses whinnied in terror as riders fought to control mounts that wanted nothing more than to flee the sudden violence. Men dove for cover behind rocks that provided inadequate protection from shooters positioned above them, with commanding fields of fire. The careful approach they had maintained during their climb dissolved into desperate scrambling for survival. Tohi's rifle joined the symphony of death, his shot taking down a man who had been trying to organize a flanking movement around the western approach to their valley. Despite his damaged left arm, he worked the bolt of his weapon with practiced efficiency, each shot deliberate and economical. There was no wasted motion in his actions, no excess emotion, just the cold professionalism of someone who had learned to kill with the same methodical precision other men brought to farming or carpentry. The return fire came quickly, muzzle flashes blossoming among the rocks below as their enemies tried to suppress the shooters who had turned their hunting expedition into a slaughter. Bullets whined off stone and shredded the mountain vegetation around their positions, but Tohi had chosen their fighting positions with Apache cunning. They were concealed, protected, and positioned to crossfire any approach to their sanctuary. "Two down," Esperanza called out as she worked the lever of her Winchester, ejecting a spent cartridge and chambering fresh ammunition. Her hands moved with automatic precision, muscle memory taking over as conscious thought focused on target acquisition and range estimation. The weeks of intensive training were paying dividends she couldn't have imagined. She was no longer fighting with desperate courage, but with calculated skill. "Four more below us, at least two trying to work around to our right flank," Tohi responded, his voice carrying clearly despite the continued gunfire. "There may be others we haven't seen yet." A new voice roared up from the rocks below, thick with fury and expensive education. "Esperanza Silva, we know you're up there, you murdering bitch. Come down and face justice like a civilized woman, and we might let you die quick." "That would be Thomas Morrison," Esperanza called back, recognizing the pompous tones of the eldest Morrison brother. "The one who thinks owning half a territory gives him the right to own half the women in it too. He's trying to keep us talking while his men get into better positions," Tohi warned. "Apache trick, distract your enemies with words while you prepare to kill them with actions. Then let's not give him the chance." Esperanza had spotted movement among the rocks 60 yards below their position. Someone in a brown coat trying to use natural cover to approach their western flank. Her rifle found its target with mechanical precision, the heavy slug punching through cloth and flesh and bone with a wet sound that carried clearly in the thin mountain air. The man in the brown coat screamed once, a sound that was cut short as he tumbled from his precarious position on the cliff face. His body bounced off rock outcroppings twice before coming to rest in a twisted heap at the bottom of a ravine that would serve as his grave. 3 down, an unknown number remaining, and the day was still young. "You killed my brothers." Thomas Morrison's voice cracked with rage and grief. "You killed Billy and Jake and Tom, and now you're murdering honest men who just want to see justice done. Honest men don't rape and pillage." Esperanza shouted back, her voice echoing off the canyon walls with a fury that matched his own. "Honest men don't break into women's homes and try to take what isn't freely given. You're a lying whore, just like your Apache grandmother was. Just like every half-breed slut who thinks she can live like white people." The racial slur hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories of 1,000 small humiliations and deliberate cruelties she had endured throughout her life. But instead of shame or hurt, she felt only a cold rage that focused her mind with crystalline clarity. This man represented everything she had spent her life trying to prove wrong. the assumption that her mixed heritage made her less than human, less deserving of respect and protection than women of pure European blood. "Keep him talking," Atohi said quietly. "I see two more trying to climb the eastern approach. If we can pin them in the open while they're exposed on the rock face, we can finish this." Esperanza adjusted her position to cover the eastern approach while maintaining her ability to fire on targets below. The movement exposed her to return fire for a few seconds, and bullets spanged off the rocks around her head with vicious intensity. But the exposure was calculated. She could see both climbers now, struggling up a nearly vertical section that left them helpless if someone could get a clear shot. Her first shot missed, the bullet striking stone just inches from the lead climber's head and showering him with rock fragments. But it had the desired effect. He lost his grip and fell 20 feet into his companion, carrying both men down in a tangle of arms and legs and terrified shouting. One of them screamed as he hit a ledge wrong, the sound suggesting broken bones and internal injuries that would take him out of the fight permanently. "That's 5, she called to Atohi. "How many more do you count?" "Morrison and at least 2 others, maybe more in reserve positions we can't see from here." His rifle spoke again, the bullets striking sparks from rocks near where someone had been trying to set up a defensive position. "But they're learning to be more careful now. The easy kills are finished. The gunfight settled into a deadly stalemate. Their enemies had learned to respect the killing ground below their positions, but they also had the numbers and supplies to wait for darkness or reinforcements or simple attrition to shift the balance in their favor. Esperanza counted her remaining ammunition, 43 rounds for the rifle, 18 for her pistol. Enough for a short fight, but not for a siege that might last hours or days. "We need to force them into the open," she said during a lull in the firing. "Make them come to us instead of letting them choose when and how to attack. What do you propose?" "Fire." The word carried grim certainty. "There's enough dry brush in this canyon to create a furnace that would force them to move or burn. The wind is in our favor, and we have escape routes they don't know about." Atohi was quiet for a moment, considering the tactical implications. It would work, but it would also destroy much of the valley, make it impossible for us to continue living here. This place would become a wasteland for years. Then we find another place. We've learned to live in the wilderness once. We can do it again. She looked at him across the distance, separating their positions, seeing understanding pass between them. "But we can't live anywhere if we're dead." Esperanza pulled a burning branch from their small cooking fire and began moving toward positions where the flames could take hold in dry grass and scattered deadfall. The plan was simple but effective. Create a wall of fire that would drive their enemies toward the valley's main entrance, where carefully prepared deadfalls and pit traps would channel them into killing zones that negated their numerical advantage. The first flames caught quickly, fed by months of drought and mountain winds that fanned small blazes into roaring conflagrations. Within minutes, smoke was pouring through the canyon, and she could hear shouts of alarm from the men below as they realized their defensive positions were about to become death traps. "They're moving," Atohi called out, "coming up the main trail just like we planned." The sound of running feet and panicked voices grew louder as their enemies abandoned their concealed positions and rushed toward the valley entrance. But Esperanza and Atohi had spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every piece of cover was either eliminated or turned into a trap that would kill anyone who tried to use it. Thomas Morrison appeared first, his expensive clothes torn and smudged with smoke, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Behind him came 2 other men, both carrying rifles and moving with the caution of people who finally understood they were fighting for their lives rather than hunting helpless prey. The fire was driving them forward, but their own intelligence was warning them that retreat into flames meant certain death, while advance might mean only probable death. "There!" Morrison pointed toward their positions with the barrel of a fancy rifle that had probably cost more than most men earned in a year. "I can see the smoke from their weapons. Rush them. There's only 2 of them, and we've got them outnumbered." It was exactly the mistake Esperanza had been hoping for. Morrison's assumption that numerical superiority would overcome tactical disadvantage. His belief that courage and determination could substitute for skill and preparation. His fundamental inability to understand that Apache warfare was about intelligence rather than bravery. Her rifle found him as he charged up the slope, the bullet taking him center mass and spinning him around like a child's toy. He fell hard, clutching at a wound that was pumping arterial blood onto the rocky ground, his expensive rifle clattering away down the slope. But even dying, he managed to keep screaming orders at his remaining men, "Kill her! Kill the bitch! Don't let her escape again!" The 2 surviving members of his party kept coming, driven by loyalty or fear or simple momentum. But they were running uphill over broken ground while under fire from concealed positions. And they were not Apache warriors trained from childhood in the art of moving under enemy observation. Etohi's shot took down the man on the left, while Esperanza's second bullet shattered the right shoulder of the final attacker, sending him tumbling backward into the smoke and flames below. Silence settled over the canyon like a burial shroud, broken only by the crackling of flames and the occasional groan from Thomas Morrison as he tried unsuccessfully to stop the bleeding that was draining his life onto the mountain stone. The smell of burned gunpowder mixed with wood smoke and something else, the metallic scent of blood spilled in large quantities, the odor that marked battlefields and slaughterhouses and other places where death came calling in numbers. Esperanza emerged from her fighting position cautiously, rifle ready for any movement that might indicate surviving enemies. But the canyon held only bodies and smoke, and the growing fire that was consuming the valley they had called home for such a brief time. 6 men had climbed up to hunt her, and 6 men would never climb down again. "Is it finished?" she called to Etohi as he approached Morrison's still-breathing form. "Almost." The Apache warrior knelt beside the dying man, his scarred face showing no emotion as he studied wounds that were clearly mortal. "He has perhaps 10 minutes before the blood loss takes him. Would you like to speak with him before he dies?" Thomas Morrison's eyes focused on her with effort, his face grey from shock and blood loss. When he spoke, his voice was weak, but still carried the arrogance that had defined his entire life. "You think you've won, bitch? You think this ends anything? There are more of us, more who will come for you, more who will make sure you pay for what you've done. Let them come," Esperanza said simply, feeling a strange peace settle over her spirit. "I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding anymore. Anyone who wants to try their luck against an Apache warrior and his woman is welcome to make the attempt." Morrison's eyes widened slightly at her words, perhaps finally understanding that the frightened woman he had been hunting no longer existed. In her place stood someone harder, more dangerous, someone who had learned to think tactically and kill efficiently and accept the consequences of her choices without flinching. "You're a monster," he whispered, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. "No," she replied, looking down at him without sympathy or regret. "I'm a survivor. There's a difference, though I don't expect you to understand it." Thomas Morrison died with hate in his eyes and curses on his lips. But he died knowing that his family's attempt to claim vengeance had failed utterly. The woman he had hunted was gone, replaced by someone who would not be hunted again. As the smoke cleared and the immediate danger passed, Esperanza found herself standing amid the wreckage of her old life and the bodies of her enemies, finally free to discover what kind of future she might build from the ashes of everything she had lost. The fire burned itself out by evening, leaving behind a blackened wasteland where their hidden valley had once provided sanctuary. Esperanza stood at the edge of the devastation, watching smoke rise from the smoldering remains of trees that had sheltered them, grass that had fed the wildlife, the small paradise Etohi had spent 3 years creating from nothing. The tactical necessity that had saved their lives had also destroyed the only home he had known since his exile. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, not turning to look at him as he approached from where he had been searching the bodies of their enemies for useful supplies. "I know what this place meant to you." "It was a place," Atohi replied, his voice carrying none of the bitterness she had expected. "Places can be rebuilt. People cannot be brought back from the dead." He stood beside her in comfortable silence, both of them surveying the damage their victory had cost. "Besides, I was never meant to live alone forever. This valley served its purpose. It kept me alive until I found something worth living for." The simple honesty of his words made her throat tighten with emotions she wasn't ready to examine too closely. 3 weeks ago, she had been a woman who expected her life to follow predictable patterns, managing her inherited property, helping neighbors with medical emergencies, perhaps eventually finding a husband who could appreciate her mixed heritage and independent spirit. Now she was someone who had killed 9 men, burned down a mountain valley, and discovered that she was capable of strategic thinking that would have impressed her cavalry officer father. "What happens now?" she asked, gesturing toward the bodies scattered across the canyon floor. "When these men don't return, when the Morrison family realizes their hunting party has been wiped out, what comes next? They will send more men, but different kinds of men. Professional killers rather than angry relatives. People who understand that we are dangerous rather than helpless." Atohi began walking toward their emergency supply cache, hidden in rocks that had survived the fire. "Or they will decide that revenge has cost them too much already and find easier targets for their anger." "Which do you think is more likely? With men like the Morrisons? They will keep coming until they are all dead or we are. Backing down from a fight with a half-Apache woman would make them look weak, and men who build their power on fear cannot afford to look weak." His scarred face was thoughtful as he considered their options. "But they will be more careful now, more respectful of our capabilities. That gives us time to prepare, to choose ground that favors us even more than this valley did, as they salvaged what they could from their burned sanctuary." Esperanza found herself studying this Apache warrior who had transformed her from a frightened refugee into someone capable of planning and executing ambushes that left 6 men dead. The change in herself was startling enough, but the change in him was even more remarkable. The bitter, isolated man she had first encountered had been replaced by someone who moved with purpose, who spoke of future plans rather than past failures, who looked at her with eyes that held hope instead of just accumulated pain. "You're different," she observed, as they packed supplies for another move deeper into the mountains. "Not just since the fight, but since I arrived. Like you've remembered something you thought was lost forever." "I have remembered what it feels like to have someone to protect," Atohi admitted, securing a bundle of dried meat and medicinal herbs with practiced efficiency. "For 3 years, I lived only for myself, and that is not enough to sustain a warrior's spirit. A man needs something beyond his own survival to fight for, something that makes the struggle worthwhile. And now you have that?" He stopped his packing and looked at her directly, his dark eyes holding depths of feeling that made her breath catch in her throat. "I have you. Whether that is enough depends on questions I do not yet have answers to." The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water, fragile and precious and terrifying in its implications. Esperanza realized that they had reached the moment when their relationship would either deepen into something neither of them had expected to find, or fracture under the weight of assumptions that might prove false. "What questions?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Whether a woman who has learned to think like a warrior can also learn to love like a woman. Whether someone who has been forced to become hard enough to survive can still be soft enough to share a life with someone else. His voice grew quieter, more vulnerable. "Whether you can see past my scars to whatever remains of the man I used to be." The last question struck her as fundamentally wrong. based on assumptions that revealed how little he understood about what she had learned during their weeks together. Tohi, I don't want the man you used to be. That man got captured and tortured and lost everything that mattered to him. That man failed to protect his family when they needed him most. She saw him flinch at her words and quickly continued before he could retreat into the defensive bitterness that had protected him for so long. I want the man you've become. The one who survived impossible trauma and kept his honor intact, who spent 3 years learning to live alone but still remembered how to trust someone else. The one who could teach a soft woman to become a warrior without destroying what made her worth protecting in the first place. You think I'm worth something? The question was asked with such careful neutrality that she understood how much courage it had taken for him to voice it. This scarred Apache warrior, who could kill efficiently and move through hostile country like a ghost, was as vulnerable to rejection as any heartbroken boy asking a girl to dance at a church social. I think you saved my life in more ways than just keeping me alive, she said honestly. I think you taught me that being damaged doesn't mean being worthless, that surviving terrible things can make you stronger rather than weaker. I think you showed me what it means to refuse to surrender even when everything seems hopeless. And is that enough for love? The question forced her to confront feelings she had been avoiding since their first night around a shared fire. Was what she felt for him love or simply gratitude mixed with physical attraction and the intense bonding that came from surviving danger together? Did it matter what label they applied to emotions that had grown in such unusual circumstances? I don't know, she said finally. I know that the thought of you dying in that fight today terrified me more than the thought of dying myself. I know that watching you move through combat was like watching deadly poetry. That seeing you protect me and our valley made me understand what it means to feel cherished rather than just desired. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in his expression. I know that when I imagine my future now, I can't picture it without you in it. Whether that's love or something else, I don't have enough experience to say. But I know it's worth finding out. For a moment, they stood in the ruins of their temporary home, surrounded by the debris of battle and the smell of smoke. Two people who had been broken by their experiences, but were slowly learning how to be whole together. When Tohi reached out with his good hand to touch her face, his fingers traced the line of her cheek with reverent gentleness that made her understand how long it had been since he had allowed himself such simple human contact. I had forgotten what hope felt like, he said softly. For 3 years, I focused only on survival, on continuing to exist one day at a time without any expectation that the future would be different from the present. But with you, I can imagine tomorrow being better than today. With me, you won't have to face tomorrow alone. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if both of them were afraid that too much passion might shatter the fragile understanding they were building. But as seconds passed and neither pulled away, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of hunger long denied, of loneliness finally finding companionship, of two damaged people discovering that their broken pieces might fit together in ways that made them stronger than either had been alone. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard, and Esperanza could see in Tohi's eyes a vulnerability that had nothing to do with physical scars. Are you certain? He asked. Once we cross this line, there is no returning to what we were before. You will be bound to an Apache outcast, a man whose own people have rejected him, who can offer you nothing but a life of constant danger and uncertainty. I was bound to you from the moment I decided to trust you with my life, she replied. Everything else is just details we'll figure out as we go. They made love that night in a cave high above the burned valley, their bodies finding comfort and connection amidst the harsh realities of their situation. Esperanza discovered that Tohi's scars extended far beyond what was visible, that the soldiers who had tortured him had been thorough in their cruelty. But she also discovered that damaged flesh could still respond to gentle touch, that broken people could still find ways to give and receive pleasure when they trusted each other enough to be vulnerable. Afterwards, as they lay wrapped together in blankets that smelled of smoke and gunpowder, Tohi spoke in a voice she had never heard from him before, soft, wondering, almost childlike in its amazement. "I thought I would never feel this again. Never trust someone enough to let them see me without defenses. Never believe that anyone could want what I have become. What you have become is exactly what I needed," Esperanza murmured against his scarred shoulder. "A teacher who could show me how to be strong. A protector who could keep me safe while I learned to keep myself safe. A partner who understands that love sometimes means being willing to kill for each other. Is that what this is? Love?" She considered the question seriously, weighing her feelings against everything she had been taught about romantic love in the civilized world she had left behind. What she felt for Tohi bore little resemblance to the gentle courtship and gradual affection that was supposed to characterize proper relationships between men and women. This was something fiercer, forged in violence and tempered by shared danger, built on mutual respect rather than social compatibility. If it's not love, it's something close enough that the difference doesn't matter, she said finally. We've chosen each other, committed to each other, been willing to die for each other. What more do we need? A future, Tohi said simply. A reason to believe that what we're building together can last longer than the next group of men who come hunting us. Then we'll build that future. We'll find a place where we can live without constantly looking over our shoulders, where we can be more than just survivors hiding in the mountains. She lifted her head to look at him in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. And if such a place doesn't exist, we'll create it ourselves. The promise hung between them like a vow, binding them to each other and to the uncertain path they had chosen to walk together. Outside their cave, the wind carried the scent of ashes and the promise of winter storms. But inside, two people who had lost everything were learning that starting over might not be about recovering what was lost, but about building something entirely new from the strength they had found in each other. 6 months after the battle that had claimed the Morrison hunting party, Esperanza stood on the edge of a different valley, one that lay hidden deep in the Colorado Rockies, where the borders between territories became meaningless, and the only law was what strong people made for themselves. The morning sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose, illuminating a landscape that held promise instead of just sanctuary. Below her, Tohi was working on the frame of what would become their permanent home, not a shelter built for quick abandonment, but a real house with glass windows and a stone fireplace, and enough room for the family they had begun to imagine together. The journey north had taken 3 months of careful travel through country, where Apache and cavalry patrols made moving during daylight hours dangerous for anyone who didn't belong to either side. They had learned to read the land with new eyes, seeing not just hiding places and ambush sites, but potential homes. Places where two people who'd been cast out by their respective societies might build something lasting. This valley, with its year-round water and natural defenses and complete isolation from the conflicts tearing apart the territories to the south, had called to them with a voice that spoke of possibilities neither had dared to imagine. "The foundation is level," Tohi called up to her, his voice carrying pride that went beyond simple craftsmanship. "By winter, we will have walls and a roof that can withstand anything these mountains can send against us." Esperanza smiled at the satisfaction in his tone, understanding that for a man who had spent 3 years living in temporary shelters, the act of building something permanent was both practical necessity and symbolic victory. They were no longer just surviving. They were creating a future that assumed tomorrow would come, and the day after that, and the day after that. She made her way down the slope to where he was working, her body moving with the unconscious grace of someone who had learned to read terrain and adjust her balance accordingly. The soft woman who had fled a burning house had been replaced by someone harder and more capable, but also someone who had learned that strength didn't require abandoning gentleness entirely. The lessons of survival could coexist with the capacity for love, violence with tenderness, wariness with hope. "Any word from our visitor?" she asked, gesturing toward the smoke rising from their temporary camp, where an unexpected guest had arrived 3 days earlier. "Maria says the territorial governor has officially declared the Morrison case closed." Itohi replied, setting down his tools and wiping sweat from his forehead. 6 men lost in the mountains, presumed dead from exposure or Indian attack. No mention of witnesses or ongoing investigations. The news brought relief that surprised Esperanza with its intensity. For months they had lived with the assumption that more hunters would come, that the Morrison family's wealth and connections would eventually bring professional killers to their trail. But Maria Gonzalez, the tough Mexican woman who ran supplies between isolated settlements throughout the Rockies, had brought word that their enemies had finally given up the hunt. Too many men lost, too much money spent, too little chance of success against quarry that had proven unexpectedly deadly. "So we're free?" Esperanza asked, hardly daring to believe it. "As free as anyone can be in this country. The law has forgotten about us, and our enemies have decided we're not worth the cost of continued pursuit." Itohi's scarred face showed an expression she had learned to recognize: cautious optimism mixed with the ingrained wariness of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune too quickly. But freedom is not the same as safety. There will always be other dangers, other people who might threaten what we're building here. Then we'll face them together, the same way we've faced everything else. The simple certainty in her voice seemed to ease something in his expression. Over the past months, they had developed the kind of partnership that came from shared danger and mutual dependence, learning to read each other's moods and capabilities with the precision of people whose survival depended on perfect coordination. But more than that, they had learned to trust each other's judgment, to rely on each other's strengths, to accept each other's weaknesses without resentment or attempts to change what couldn't be altered. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and Maria Gonzalez emerged from the tree line with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades moving through dangerous country. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than size. Her pack train could carry supplies to places no one else would risk visiting, and her word was trusted by outlaws and lawmen alike. "Your house is taking shape," she observed, studying the foundation and framing with the eye of someone who understood construction. "You planning to winter here?" "Planning to live here," Esperanza replied. "Permanently, a bold choice. This valley is isolated enough to keep you safe from most troubles, but isolation cuts both ways. If you have medical emergencies or need supplies you can't make or grow yourselves, help is a long way off." "We've learned to be self-sufficient," Itohi said, "and Esperanza has medical training that could serve this region well, once word spreads that there's a skilled healer living up here." Maria's eyebrows rose slightly at that information. "A healer? Trained where?" "My father was a cavalry surgeon during the war," Esperanza explained. "He taught me field medicine, surgical techniques, how to treat everything from bullet wounds to broken bones to fever. I've been practicing for years, though unofficially. Officially or not, medical knowledge is worth its weight in gold out here. Half the settlements in these mountains haven't seen a real doctor in years." Maria settled onto a log near their work site, her expression thoughtful. "I could spread word carefully. Let people know there's someone up here who can help with serious injuries or difficult births. Might bring you some income, and definitely would bring you friends." The suggestion carried implications that went beyond simple economic opportunity. If Esperanza became known as a healer serving the scattered communities of the high country, it would give them a legitimate reason to be here, an identity that had nothing to do with their violent past. They could become valued members of the loose network of ranchers, miners and settlers who eked out livings in places too remote for conventional authority to reach. What about my heritage? Esperanza asked. Some people might not want medical care from someone who's part Apache. Some people are idiots, Maria replied bluntly. But most folks up here care more about results than bloodlines. A woman who can save their children or set their broken bones properly isn't going to face too many questions about her ancestry. Over the following days, as Maria prepared to continue her supply run to settlements further north, they discussed the practical details of establishing Esperanza as the region's unofficial doctor. Word would spread gradually through the network of traders and travelers who connected the isolated communities, carried by people who understood that discretion was often the difference between life and death in country where past mistakes could catch up with anyone. Within a year, if Maria was right, they might have regular patients traveling from dozens of miles away to seek treatment that couldn't be found anywhere else. The prospect of having a purpose beyond simple survival filled Esperanza with excitement she hadn't felt since before her father's death. The medical knowledge he had passed down to her, which had seemed irrelevant to their mountain exile, might become the foundation for a new kind of life. Instead of hiding from civilization, they could create their own version of it, a place where healing happened regardless of politics or prejudice, where her mixed heritage became an advantage rather than a liability. "There's something else," Maria said on her last evening with them, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering information that might be either welcome or devastating. "Word from down south is that there's been Apache raids near the Mexican border. Young warriors trying to rescue children who were taken by the cavalry years ago." Esperanza felt Atohi tense beside her, saw the careful neutrality settle over his features like a mask. This was the first news they had received about his former people since beginning their new life, and she could see him struggling with emotions he had worked hard to bury. "Any names mentioned?" he asked quietly. "Nothing specific, but the descriptions match someone who might be related to you, a war leader who's been organizing rescue missions. Someone the soldiers call Ghost Walker because he can move through their lines without being detected." Maria's eyes were sympathetic but honest. "If it's who I think it might be, he's been asking questions about warriors who went missing during the last major raids 3 years ago." "My brother," Atohi said simply. "He's looking for me." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from their evening fire, carrying implications that could reshape everything they had built together. If Atohi's brother was actively searching for him, if there was a possibility of reconciliation with his people, what would that mean for their plans? Would he choose blood family over the life they were creating together? Could she follow him back into a world where her mixed heritage might make her an outsider in different ways? "What will you do?" Esperanza asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Nothing," Atohi replied, his tone carrying absolute certainty. "I was cast out by my people, including my brother. If he regrets that decision now, he knows where to find me. But I will not abandon the life we're building to chase after acceptance from those who rejected me when I needed them most. But if he came here, if he wanted to make amends, then he would be welcome at our table, as any traveler would be welcome. But my home is here now, with you, in the life we're creating together." His scarred hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the natural ease of long practice. "I spent 3 years mourning what I had lost. I will not waste whatever years remain mourning what might have been." Maria nodded approvingly at his words. "Smart man. The past has a way of devouring the present if you let it. Better to build something new than spend your life trying to rebuild what's already gone." As their visitor prepared for departure the next morning, Esperanza felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. Maria's presence had been a reminder of the larger world beyond their valley, but also confirmation that they were choosing their path wisely. They were not running from life, but toward it, not hiding from their potential, but pursuing it in a place where their particular combination of skills and experiences would be valued rather than feared. "Take care of each other," Maria said as she loaded her pack animals for the journey north. And remember that healing people, whether their bodies or their spirits, is holy work, regardless of what any church might say about it. As the sound of her pack train faded into the distance, Esperanza and Atohi stood together, looking at the framework of their house, at the garden they had planted, at the land they were learning to call home. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer terrifying, filled with possibilities they were strong enough to pursue together. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing this life, choosing me, instead of trying to return to your people or find some other path?" "Every day," Atohi replied, and her heart clenched until he continued. "I regret that it took so much pain and loss to bring us together. I regret that we had to learn love through violence, trust through betrayal, hope through despair. But I have never regretted choosing you, choosing this life, choosing to believe that two damaged people could build something whole together. Even if we never have the approval of either of our peoples, even if we're always outsiders, always having to prove ourselves worthy of basic respect. Especially then, because we've learned that the only approval that matters is what we give each other. The only respect worth having is what we earn through our actions. The only home worth keeping is what we build with our own hands." The sun climbed higher over their valley, illuminating a day that held work to be done, a house to be finished, a future to be created one careful decision at a time. Esperanza looked at this scarred Apache warrior who had taught her that strength came not from avoiding damage, but from refusing to let damage define her limits, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had learned to face everything else, together, with eyes open and hearts committed to the belief that love could triumph over any force that tried to tear it apart. In a land where women were expected to submit and men were expected to conquer, they had chosen a different path, partnership based on mutual respect, strength that included the courage to be vulnerable, victory that meant building rather than destroying. It was not the life either of them had expected, but it was the life they had chosen, and that made all the difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.